Greetings, fellow quitters, and welcome back to the Command Q podcast. We're your hosts. I'm John Pelfrey.
I'm Maari Casey.
And it's the summer of scaling here at Uncompany. So this tends to be a quieter time of year for us and probably for your business too. That makes it the perfect time to get organized around growth. If that plan may involve working with subcontractors, this episode is for you.
In our last episode, we talked about what it takes to set your contractors up for success with great scopes. And today we are going to be talking about protecting your businesses as you grow. If you're interested in bringing in other freelancers to represent your business, it is important to be proactive about setting expectations, managing risk, and deciding how disputes will be resolved before you get into the middle of them. We're not lawyers, and none of this is legal advice, but we are business owners who have learned a thing or two about getting ahead of conflict. So let's dive in.
Yeah, we are definitely not lawyers.
No.
Yeah, I made that decision when I learned how much you had to read to get a law degree. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to go do that.
And you got to read legal stuff. And that's like, whoa.
Yeah, pay smart people to do that. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So warm-up question here. Were you insistent on working under a contract when you first started your business, or did you just hope for the best?
Yeah, it's been so long since I first started, but I know probably in the beginning, I probably did have some kind of a loose document. And I mean, like very loose, lots of holes in it and lots of mistakes, which we covered in our podcast and a webinar on writing good scopes about how not to do that. I think where I probably fell short was when I was working at a project or with a new client that maybe was a friend or a colleague or came as a recommendation, or maybe was like a super small business. And I just didn't want to come across as like too bossy or too like pushy and be like, hey, super small business, like here's a very fancy contract. And so I didn't do a great job from the beginning of making sure things were really buttoned up. And I think that's probably the case for most people who are starting out, is you feel a little like I'm trying to be all big and bad and overly professional when I'm just starting out. And that can highlight a lot of times where when we're starting out our business, we don't treat ourselves like a real business because we're not real yet. And that's usually manifests itself in like writing squishy scopes or sometimes not having any kind of contracts or agreements up front. And that's a bad spot to start from.
Yeah, 100%. I was a little bit the opposite because I started my career in corporate America, like a Fortune 30 giant company. And I was very used to sort of negotiating contracts, talking about contracts. The lawyer used to call me all the time to say, hey, how should I word this phrase so that we don't get in trouble about the software that we make when we're making a contract? I want to make sure that I have my facts straight and, all of that. So I got really used to reading contracts, writing parts of contracts, working with other people to build contracts. And so for me, it kind of made sense also with a little bit of the project management background. I was like, well, we're at least going to start with some sort of scope of work with some sort of like brief and some details and definitely a timeline and definitely a budget and definitely, some of the basics in there. But as with anything, you learn as you go and you learn actually what's necessary and what's important versus maybe some extra fluff that really isn't all that important. But yeah, for me, I was definitely all about like, let's document exactly what I'm delivering, start and end date, budget, expectations around milestones and deliverables, all those sort of basic things. But I won't say that I didn't have like a master service agreement level, multiple pages of all the things. Like I never had that though.
Mm-hmm.
That comes when you start working with the bigger vendors and they start saying like, hey, can you provide proof of insurance? And then we need you to sign this giant document for us that says that we own everything that you do and your firstborn child in order to get paid in 90 days and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yes. And that's when you get an attorney, a lawyer to review that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's when you get an attorney and you make sure, that one, you need to understand what it is that you're agreeing to and signing. I think that's an often overlooked part of this is like, you really need to understand is, I think we've all been guilty of this. Like I'm guilty of this. Like I terms of service pops up on a piece of software and you just like scroll to the bottom and hit the accept button or the agree button. And then you're like, what did I just give away? What did I just agree to by using this thing? But we're all guilty of like not reading contracts all the way. And if you're sitting in front of people, especially, and they're like, here, sign this, and you're like, well, I'm not a speed reader and I don't know what this is. And you tell me that it's okay. But when you start to work and start to do your business and everything, like make sure that whatever documents you're signing, like you really understand them. And it's perfectly okay to say, thank you for this document. I will look this over, and I might have
You'll-
someone else look it over, and we'll get back to you after we've reviewed it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. What are the biggest risks when it comes to working with subcontractors?
We've talked with a couple of our senior freelancers about it and their experience with the subcontractors. And I remember my first experiences, and it's really just not being buttoned up about some of the main things, one of which is the scope. What are you doing? What's the expectation for delivery? What are you delivering? What's the time you're delivering in? And then what are you getting paid? And those things just need to be really buttoned up. Where I see a lot of weirdness, the ickiness when you work with subs, where some of the conflict comes in, is when you're not really clear about what that scope includes, like how many rounds of revisions are going to be factored in, and then what am I getting paid? Where it's like, don't ever put a range of payment down, be like, this is what I'm expecting. And if you're doing a range, then you need to add that on top of that and expect that range on your side. Because where it gets uncomfortable is like, if I'm thinking I'm going to pay a subcontractor 75 for this project or whatever, and then I'm adding on top of that my margin for the client knows like I'm going to pay me 100, which means I'm going to make 25 and I'm going to pay my freelancer 75. What happens is if a freelancer comes in, they're like 75 plus whatever for revisions or plus hourly, and there's that scope that starts to kind of creep in and that cost creeps up. Then all of a sudden, my margin's getting smaller and smaller. And I might get to the end of the project and maybe I make no money, or I make $5 or whatever that looks like. And then I start to be kind of angry and frustrated towards my subcontractor. Or I go back to my client and ask for more money, and I have to deal with that awkward conflict. So you're kind of in the middle when you're working with subs. You're managing a client and you're also managing your subs. And it can be a really tricky spot unless you're 100% clear on all the details of the scope. So you really, really have to know, what does the scope look like from what am I getting delivered? And then how much am I paying both sides? What am I invoicing the client? And then what am I paying my subs? If you're not clear with that, then the risk is you're going to make the client mad and frustrated. You're going to make your contractor mad and frustrated, and the relationships are going to be damaged on both sides. And that's just that's a really tricky spot to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime you're sitting in the middle of something, I think you're the one that's most likely to get squeezed. That's
for sure.
That's the nature of being in the middle. And so you got to be aware. Also, if you're worried about getting squeezed, then build margin on both sides of that equation, not just on one side of the equation. That would be another way to look at it. I need to build margin with my time, with my budget on the client side, and I need to do the same thing on the freelancer side. I need to build, a 20% margin for time on both sides, a 20% margin for budget on both sides, and then expect for that to be squeezed down a little bit. Might be one way that you could handle it.
Yeah.
If it all works out and you end up with 20% margin on this side and that side, then that's 40% margin. That's wonderful. That's great. That's kind of where you want to be. But, expect that to go down. But yeah, when you get down to the point where, and I think probably everybody's done this at some point, where you do a project and you make the $5, or maybe you're in the hole or whatever, and you go like, oh God, I bit off more than I can chew. That's a tough situation too. What do you do in that situation? Like, part of me says you have to live up to your obligation to the freelancer, to me, to the subcontractor. At the same time, you have to live up to your obligation to the client. And if the client says, I'm not paying you any more money, and the subcontractor says, you owe me more money.
Yeah.
How do you resolve that? What are some ways that you can, if you didn't build in that budget, do you just eat it and go like, this is a lesson learned? This is, to me, that's kind of what ends up having to happen.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you just pay for that education and it sucks. And it's a bummer, but that will teach you to have much more buttoned up contracts. I mean, the way to cover yourself is to make sure things are ironclad and clear on both sides and there's no squishiness. So if your client contract says this covers 3 rounds of revisions for these deliverables within this timeline, and whatever they're asking for exceeds that, and your freelancer says, hey, this is now the 4th round, this exceeds the contract that we had, then you have documentation, you have proof to go back to the client and say, the contract we signed and that you agreed to covers 3 rounds of revisions for these deliverables within this timeline. We're now outside of that. And it's really, really crystal clear. Like, you want to make sure it's really, really crystal clear so that you can go back and advocate for more money for your freelancer. You say, okay, yes, like this is going to be more money. It's been outlined. And then you can go back and say, yes, freelancer, yes, contractor, clients agrees, this is out of scope. Here's the amendment. And then you're amending on both sides. That's that's what you need to have happen. And if it doesn't happen and you're not doing that, then yeah, sometimes you have to eat that. I think the one thing that people don't realize when you're sitting in the middle is that you have to be okay advocating for your contractors when it makes sense. I mean, sometimes, maybe you have a bad contractor and they're not delivering or they're whatever. And then you can say like, hey, contractor, you have to advocate for your client. Like what they're asking, what the client is asking is not unrealistic and is within the scope of what we signed and what you agreed to. The flip side, you go, hey, client, what the freelancer is asking for, more money, more time or whatever, is within the contract that we assign and agree to. It's not unrealistic. So you have to be okay if you're going to play that role of advocating both directions when it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go back to a phrase that you used in that. You said, when we go outside of the terms, I think that's a really good way to look at it. If you put the terms and you imagine that they fit inside of a container, and then those terms exceed the size of the container, if there's an extra round of revision that you documented, or it's more expense, like there could be real expenses, hard expenses. I have to rent this equipment, or I have to pay this or whatever. Like all those should be covered. But I like the phrase, we've gone outside of that, or we've grown outside of that, because then it's not accusatory. I think one of the things that you really run into, if you've never done this before, is this feeling of like they're abusing our relationship, or they're, trying to push things on me, or they're trying to like get one over on me or whatever. And by you like reframing it as like, we agreed to something that fits inside this container and now it's grown to be larger than the container. It's an easier discussion to have. And it frames it in a way that it's very difficult to argue with.
Absolutely.
Without being, aggressive about it.
And I think it's, your contracts and agreements they don't need to be a negative thing. I think with your freelancers, sometimes, especially when people are a junior and they're starting to work as freelancers for the first time or the first subcontracting situation, you'll get that vibe from them, like whoa, like they'll get frustrated, and you're like, oh, it's fine. Like we understand that this is outside of scope. Like you have to help them understand for them too that they can also push back and say, hey, would love to work on this for you. Would love to add another round of revisions or whatever. That's outside of scope. As opposed to what I see sometimes where it's like they get really frustrated because then they feel like they're being asked to work with that and not get paid. So it's also part of like you sitting in that role to say like, I'm here to help protect you as well as protect the client. And this is what we're going to do. And that's a good thing. I mean, the reason why you have a contract is so you have something documented that you can push back on and that you can say like, yeah, this container is now too small for what we're asking. And honestly, a lot of times with clients, when they're asking for additional rounds, they just don't know. They're not trying to be predatory most of the time. They're trying to be like, I need to get this done and we need another round. And you just have to like keep them updated on what we agreed to. And that is just because they're busy people and they're not like sitting in front of the document all the time. So that's part of what we have to do is make it really clear, like, okay, we're going outside of scope.
Yeah, they're not counting rounds of revisions the way that you might be, or you're, because for them, it is exactly that. They're busy and they're just like, we need to get this done. But you as the project manager, you're now going, okay, this is costing me more money. And so it's more important for you. But if you're a creative and you've never managed projects in this way before, go talk to your former project managers at the other jobs that you worked with and get some advice from them. Because these types of conversations become very normal for people like us. But I know they're outside of the comfort zone of a lot of people that are really just used to be doing the creative work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the problems that we might run into with like things like, what if a client really likes the sub that they're working with and they want to sort of like move you out of the equation because they don't need you anymore, and they go like, I just want to work directly with one of your subs. How do you handle a situation like that?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. That's actually a good one we haven't talked about yet. The way that we're set up to basically, if you work through us for a year and then you want to transition, then you can transition. I do think like when you're starting out, I think it's a discussion that you could have with your other subcontractors that you're working with. Like, hey, the client wants to work with you directly. That could be totally fine to you. You could also say, like, when I was just starting out and I was freelancing, it was fine. Like, I was like, I'm not going to worry about non-competes. I'm not going to worry about like, any kind of transition fee or whatever. Like when you build a business like we do, where that is part of our business, then there's more of an issue because we're owning the client relationship. Like our relationship is with the client and you're working with us. So I think it's just something that you have to figure out what makes sense for you. I mean, when I was starting out in freelancing, I started working with subcontractors. I didn't want to put that level of friction because then I also honestly wanted them to bring me work. Typically what I would do if if I was a subcontractor on a project that someone else brought to me, then I and a client came to me and said, hey, what if we cut Becky out and I just work directly with you? Then I would say, hey, I love working with you guys, but Becky does own the relationship with you guys and I wouldn't want to do that to her. So I'd love to like have a discussion with Becky and see how this can all work together, because she's also the point of contact that I work with directly. Because a lot of times I think for freelancers, you don't realize that the person who brought you in on the project is probably offering you a barrier a little bit, offering you a good cushion so that you can just focus on doing the work. You're not having to do the account management and the client management because they're doing that for you. So don't underestimate that as a real nice perk for you and you're just getting the work. Like that's a really great thing too. So I think it's a good discussion to have up front. So if you are a freelancer bringing in subs like with your client, like how that would work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I could see a little bit of, if I'm the client and I'm really only needing to use the skills of that one sub and I don't need the skills of maybe the rest of the team that we built for a previous project or something like that. I could see saying like, oh, okay, so going forward after this project is all wrapped up, I really just want to work directly, with this one person. But to me as the client, I would want to talk to Becky, the main point of contact or whatever in this case, and say, going forward, I'd really like to work directly with Maari. I've got a couple of projects that are really just fit in her skill set. Is it okay with you if we just hire Maari directly for the next job that we have? For a lot of people, that's totally fine. But it's really important to me as the client to be able to say, to like treat Becky fairly in that situation, right?
Yeah.
And then at the freelancer side, I think it's exactly what you said too. If I'm playing the role of the freelancer, would be to come back to Becky and say, hey, the clients approached me directly. Have they talked to you about it? Is this, it's okay? All that sort of thing. The last thing you want to do, I think, is feel like you're going around someone's back.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the client doesn't intend for that to even be the case. They're just like busy and they're like, hey, Maari,
Right.
I could use you in this next project. It's all about keeping everybody in the loop. That's really what it is.
Well, and if you're a freelancer and you might be like, this person's brought me a bunch of work, I don't want to make them mad. And then all of a sudden I cut off that pipeline for future business. So it's you need to assess what makes sense for you and what the relationship looks like.
Yeah. And it's, we're all, in some ways it's like, we're all friends here. Let's try to remain friends, let's be open and honest. And then that way we can all continue to help and support each other. Because what goes around comes around, as they say. Sometimes. So how can you use contracts or agreements to anticipate sort of the most common friction points? I mean, we've talked about a couple of them already.
I'm trying to think of the first time that we actually started working with an independent contractor agreement. And it was very early. I don't know if I had one before officially starting Uncompany, but an independent contract agreement or an ICA, as you might see it, is actually a really good thing to get in place if you're working with contractors or subs as in general. And it can cover a lot of the things we just discussed. Like you could have something in your ICA agreement that's like if a client comes directly to you, this is the course of action. I agree not to work with clients directly if it's been introduced by me, or there's a fee or something like that. It can cover ownership of work, like all work is owned by the client. And I understand that. It can cover like how you're working with the client. Like I think our ICA has like, you're not discussing rates and budgets with clients. We're managing that for you. So please don't do that. So it can cover a lot of that stuff and get that out of the way, like up front, which I think is really, really good to do. I mean, even if you're just starting out working with subs, you can be very, very basic and simple, but that helps to cover a lot of those possible friction points. Because I think one of the things I've seen too is it's not clear who's managing the money, or a subcontractor gets frustrated with rounds of revisions. And so they go to the client talking about money. And then that's confusing if the budget that the freelancer's getting is not the same as what the client's paying. So I think it's really good to have an ICA upfront just because that helps to like set the table before you get into work.
Yeah. Another one too would be like payment terms, between the primary contact and the subcontractors. so that that's all set up front, and the subcontractor knows when I invoice you, I'm getting paid in 30 days or 45 days or 60 days or whatever it is. And then if you're the primary contact in that situation, again, you need to leave a little bit of wiggle room. If your payment terms with the client, let's say, are net 30, you don't want to set your payment terms with your subs at net 15, because then you've got to put the money out 15 days before you might potentially get paid. And even setting it right at net 30 still means you might end up floating money for up to 7 to 10 days, honestly.
It does. Yeah.
Depending on when things come in and go out and all of that. So keep that in mind. Like if you're net 30 with your client, you probably want to be net 45 with your subs just to give yourself a cushion, So think about that. Payment terms, I think, are really important. And then also the how you're going to pay the sub as well. Are you paying through a bank transfer or a paper check or a whatever? Just those like mechanical things really, really help to clarify upfront too. Because you don't want to get to the end of that and be ready to pay, and then you cut them a check and put it in the mail, and the person's like, "Why did you mail it? It's going to take another 4 days for it to get to my house. Can you just Venmo it to me?" Whatever. Like cover all of those basic, simple things in an ICA.
And I think to highlight the payment stuff too, because I think that is obviously the big one. Everyone wants to get paid. This is where like being overly friendly and accommodating can bite you. I'm very friendly and accommodating. Absolutely. I'm probably too friendly and accommodating a lot of times. I've gotten better. I've gotten more rigid. But
you've gotten better, yeah.
I think having those contracts set up and being like, this is what's going to have to happen. And then trying to remove emotion from it. Like if your subcontractor is your friend, which happens a lot of times, and they're like, hey, is there any way I get paid 50% up front? But you know that you've agreed to the client that you can't bill up front. You have to bill based on work delivered. And so you have to go back and just say, I can't do that for this client. And you don't have to explain why. You don't have to say because of this. So you can just say, we just can't do that for this client. I'm really sorry. Like we can pay you as soon as work is delivered plus payment terms. And they have to understand that before they sign the contract. You have to be really clear as part of the negotiation, as part of finding the right people. They have to agree to the terms that you can make work. You should not get into a situation where you're floating payment because you feel bad. Because what happens is like, what if the client doesn't pay you? What if it gets tied up in procurement? And then now you're paying credit card, you're paying on credit cards because you're having to, that is a terrible spot to start from. So stressful. So you just have to know like, this is what's going to work and this is what's going to happen. And if they say, I can't do that, I have to get paid 50% up front. And you say, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. And you find another subcontractor. But from experience, don't get in a situation where you're floating or you're hoping the client's going to pay because you've already paid. Like, try to remove the emotion from it, understanding that you're humans working with humans and like you want to be caring. And you can say like, I love working with you. I care about you, but this is what this contract has to be. And just understand that sometimes it just won't work out. And that's not a bad thing. That's just part of it.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you agree to with the client, you essentially kind of want to mirror that back to the sub in some ways, a lot of times. If the client's not the type of client that'll pay up front, 50% up front, and you've tried to negotiate that and they've said, no, absolutely not, because we have this reason in this procurement process or whatever. Yeah. You kind of need to. And, honestly, if you freelanced for any amount of time at all, you know that every single client does payment differently. Their cash flow is different. Their accounts payable and accounts receivable are different. Like everything is different on a per client basis. People are on all kinds of different pieces of software and processes and all of that. So for I think most freelancers, they get that it's going to be a little bit different, one client to the next. But yeah, if you're working, especially with somebody new, that's your friend who's never done this before, even just understanding the idea of like payment terms. If you're the one that has to explain that to someone, sometimes it can feel uncomfortable at first, but it's like, that's just the way the world works. Like I'm not holding your money for 45 days. Like it's just, it takes that long for the other company to get through all their people to get it approved and paid and whatever, and then get it in my hands. And then it takes a couple of days to flip that and turn it over to you,
And I think a lot of people don't understand, a lot of new freelancers don't understand it. I can remember starting out and getting invoices that only paid upon receipt. That's why it's really important in your ICA or upfront to say, my payment terms are net 45. So once your invoice is submitted to me and it is approved by me, that's when the clock starts. And they have to get that before they agree to the project. The worst is when you let it happen, the project goes through, they've agreed on what the project cost is, but you haven't agreed on the payment terms. And then it's all of a sudden at the end of the project and you're like, oh, sorry, the client doesn't pay me for net 60. I can't pay you until net 60. And they're like, well, my business runs due upon receipt. And you're just, And that sucks. Like, you don't want to wait till the end of the project to be like, and now you have to wait 2 months to get paid. You want to have them agree to that before the project starts. Because we can use Uncompany as an example. It's like, I want to pay everybody immediately. Like, I understand what it's like to be a freelancer. And we were net 30 for probably like the first 8 years. And then COVID hit and everybody hiked their payment terms up. And it's like, and you can't run your business when you're having to wait 45, 60, and sometimes 90 for some of our clients to get paid, and you've already paid this up. So it's very payment terms. I'm glad you brought up, because that's something that really can derail a relationship if you're not really, really buttoned up and clear about that upfront in your ICA and in your contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a confusing one too. It's one of those things where until you've worked with a bunch of different clients and you've experienced it in a bunch of different ways, it can just be very confusing and difficult.
Mhm.
That's why I go back to whatever you're negotiating with the client for this particular job and project, kind of think about mirroring that with your sub, and then add a little cushion of time, a few days or whatever it is to it. That way everybody knows and understands. But yeah, right up front, you don't want to get to the end of the project and somebody's like, yeah, I got to pay my mortgage tomorrow or I'm going to lose my house. And you're like, I mean, first of all, hopefully it doesn't get to that. But that would be an awful situation. So yeah. Anyway, all right. So can you create your own contracts, or should you work with an attorney? Or I guess another way to think of this is like, at what point should I pull an attorney in?
I think, there's a lot of attorneys that will work on just a flat fee. So if it makes you feel comfortable, we always talk about this with taxes too. Like, there's certain points where like it's worth it to pay a professional person to deliver some of these things, even though it's a cost. Yes. Can you find ICA agreements online as templates? Yes. Maybe that's a good starting point for you for the first year. Sounds good. At some point, I think it's good to have an attorney look over everything and find the holes and tighten it up a little bit. One of the things we didn't talk about too is just having an attorney to consult with, where it's like employment related stuff. I think when you're starting to work with contractors, you're kind of putting yourself in the position of an employer. So it's good to be an understanding of like what laws are around you for employment. Like, I can't ask you to come in and work at my house. I can't tell you what to do. I can hire you, but do you have flexibility? You can work on there's certain rules around that kind of stuff that is like scary and changes a lot, and it can change per state. So it's good to have an attorney, even if it's somebody who you can just like, I need to talk to you for an hour, or I want to have you look over my ICA and redline and mark it up. Like, talk to these attorneys, find some private ones, find some ones that are like running a small business just like you, and see what they'll charge you and just get an idea. I think a lot of times we don't even approach that idea because we're like, oh my gosh, it's going to be $500 an hour. Like, that's insane. Talk to them and say like, do you guys do flat fee consulting? Can I share my agreement and see if you can help me? So just look at that and see what that looks like, because some of those things that if left not reviewed can cause a lot of issues as you grow as a business. It's like, maybe you can get a template down and then start to build from there. But having somebody in your back pocket that you can trust who's an attorney is awesome, is worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, you mentioned this, but different states have different laws and different rules. So what applies to us here in North Carolina doesn't apply to a freelancer in New York or in California or in even Tennessee or Virginia, which are next door neighbors to us. Some of it might, and then others might be very different. So just be aware of that too. If you're working with friends and they live in different states and they live under a different set of laws and everything like that, even though you're friends, there could be issues there. So just consider that when you pull something off the internet, you also have to think about like, where was this written? Who was it written for? Was it written in the United States?
What year was it written?
What year was it written? What are the laws? And so those are some of the dangers of pulling something off of the internet just randomly. Like, if you pull an ICA agreement off the internet and it was written for the EU, that like half of that might not even work in the United States, or vice versa. So,
and I think if you even contracts, it's one of the things that I ran into early on. If I'm writing a contract for a freelance designer or a writer, like, I understand how to do that. But as soon as I started working with people who were producing art, so photographers, illustrators, musicians, that is a whole other type of contract. That is a licensing thing. You're dealing with art buying, you're dealing with stock. And that's when you really need to get help understanding, like, if I'm writing a contract for a creative that's doing design, that's one thing. But if they're creating art, if they're creating photos and they want a license, then I need to make sure that I understand how to do that, or I understand how to put that in a contract. So then I need to consult with an art buyer or, somebody who's written that type of stuff, so that my contracts don't leave me or my client in a lurch when we get into licensing fees and things like that. So, as you're starting to build your team and starting to subcontract with different types of skills, it's really good to, also talk to other creatives who have done it, ask them about what they're using, how their contracts are structured, how that changes when they're going to different types of relationships with different subs. But that is another place too that you can be like, oof, you can really get it taken out from under you if you haven't built the licensing part of your contracts together.
Yeah, licensing versus work for hire. There's all kinds of copyright laws around anything that could be considered art. And you need to know and understand that, like, if let's say a musician has written a song and it wasn't for the project that you're working on, it's just something that they wrote, and then you want to use that to maybe put it as background music on a video or whatever, like, yeah, you need to pay a licensing fee for that. And there's a whole process for that. You can't just take it and use it. You got to pay a license for it. But at the same time, maybe you commission a musician to write a song specifically for your video, and you could use that and pay them as like a work for hire, which means that you're essentially buying the song from them. And the difference is, and this is photography is the same way, right? You can license an image or you can buy the image outright, but the cost of that's going to be significantly different. A license is going to usually be a lot cheaper depending on the use of it versus buying the whole copyright outright where they can never ever use it again and you have exclusive rights to it and all that. They're going to charge you a whole lot more money generally if they're smart. So yeah, so just be aware of that. Like, when you get into licensing, that's probably a whole other like set of podcasts and discussions.
Yeah, I would add a consultant besides an attorney with an art buyer. Like if you have anybody who's in art buying or licensing, just ask them about like some of the stuff they've seen and what they would recommend putting into a contract just to like CYA, especially when you're working with those types of creatives. Because, even stock, even when you're buying stock for projects, and we talked a little bit about how that's covered in your scope of work and contracts, but, stock photography can get really complicated and get really confusing. And a lot of clients will come to you and they'll have no idea that even exists as a thing and what the cost looks like. And it's unfortunately for us sitting in the position we are, that's our job to educate them and say, hey, I understand that you really, really like this Elvis song and you want us to put it on the back of this innovation. Not going to happen. And here's why. But here's some other options. It's like, tell them why, educate them. And they'll honestly really appreciate that for me. It's like, I know that you pulled this picture off the internet and you think it's perfect. We don't know where that came from and we can't use that. And here's another option. So tell them why, educate them in a way that's like informative and not dismissive, and then give them an option and another solution. And then you're kind of the hero. But you'll see that a lot of times, especially with smaller businesses who just don't know that licensing and cost and that stuff is a big factor.
Yeah. I could talk about that one all day because I have so many stories about music licensing, my music business days. But it is funny, those little things, like you start to figure out that really, honestly, until the last couple of years, if you heard a Beatles song in a movie, it was never the original recording by the Beatles. It was always a cover sung by someone else. And that's because the licensing fees to license a Beatles song were out of this world. Yeah. And half the time they would just never, ever do it. And so you'd get someone else to sing it and then you just have to pay the publishing rights. That's all other thing. But it's the same kind of thing with all of this is like, once you dive into those types of things, it's probably worth it to get a lawyer or an expert that knows what they're talking about when it comes to art buy, music licensing, all that. And those people are out there and they exist. And some of them are just like lawyers and accountants. They're not as expensive as you think they might be.
Yeah.
All right. So if you have a subcontractor relationship that started without a formal contract, how can you introduce one like, in the middle of that relationship? Like you probably don't want to do it in the middle of the project that you're working on. Yeah. But maybe between projects or something, you say like, hey, I'm trying to button up my business. And like, how do you do that?
I think even if you're in the middle of a project, I think it's okay to go to them and say, hey, I know we've already started and this is rolling, but like, I'm trying to get better about get things buttoned up. And you're my first sub I've worked with, can we go ahead and do like an ICA agreement and a contract for this project just so we have it in paper, in writing? And go for it. And you might have an issue. You might run into a situation where you introduce like net 45 payment terms and they're like, whoa. I started this project believing that I was going to be paid upon receipt. And then you have to work through that conflict and either come a little this way, come a little that way or whatever and make it work. Like you could say, well, how do I pay you net 15 knowing that the next project's going to be net 30 or whatever it is. But I would just be upfront and transparent and don't delay. If you realize you're started and you're like, oh crap, I really should have put something together. Then do it, do it and push them on it and understand that you might get into some bumps just because that wasn't figured out up front. But yeah, I think it's good to get something in place sooner rather than later.
Yeah, just be aware that if it's in the middle of the project, be aware that it could affect the project if you introduce things that could cause conflict. Now, The other way you could look at that, though, is, well, I solved that conflict or introduced the question about that conflict before it became a really big issue.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe my advice earlier, like, yeah, you should do it whenever you feel like you need to, especially like payment terms and things. Like, you don't want to find out after the fact, and then that'd be a bigger problem.
Mhm.
All right. Well, let's move on to our lightning round here. So, at what point in the onboarding process should you present your subs with a contract?
Once they have approved the estimate, like once you've sent them the scope and they've sent you their estimate and you're like, yep, that looks good. And they're like, yep, that looks good. Then you just formalize that into a contract, get that signed. And that's all. Obviously, you've taken it to a client, and the client said, yep, that's a good. Client signed it, freelancer signed it. So before you start any kind of work, kick things off and everything, you need to formalize it into a contract. But it has to be, it has to be agreed on by the client as well. So both sides need to agree before you start any kind of work.
Yeah. I mean, typically the way that we do it is once everybody agrees on the estimates, we send the client a statement of work. We send the freelancers a statement of work kind of at the same time that says this is what we all agreed to, right? And then that way it kind of all kind of works at the same time, and you can get the contract kicked off relatively quickly. If you wait like for the client to sign their contract before you send one of the subs, in some ways that's safer or better, but as long as you've written all that out and everybody knows that you're in negotiating phase on both sides, it'll speed along the process. Besides of this, clients aren't going to wait forever for you to kick off the contract. You do have to do this with some level of expediency.
Yeah, because I mean, we've definitely had situations where it's like everybody says it's good, and then we're like sending it to the client, and the client is on vacation or whatever, and then we're like, let's go ahead and kick it off, and then all of a sudden we kick it off, and then they change the contract before it's signed, and that sucks because then you got to go back to the freelancer, be like, I know we kicked off inside, but now the project's ended or something's changed or whatever. I think it's definitely good to like do that, and you're right, it does push the client. The client might be like, well, we still need to have Becky sign it, and you could be like, well, that's fine, but we can't kick off until like things are all copacetic. And the other part of it too is making sure that what you have in one contract is reflected in the other one. I mean, it literally should be a mirror. I've definitely seen it, and I have done it where I'm like, I write something for the freelancer and I don't transpose it, or I add something to like soften it or whatever to the client, and then there's confusion. So just make sure it's completely the same. They both know that this is what's happening.
Yeah. Just copy and paste the deliverables from one to the other, copy and paste the timeline from one to the other, copy and paste everything. If you're adjusting, the subcontractors getting a payment, that's the only thing that's different really, is the subcontractors like payment things, but all the milestones should be the same, everything else like that. Yeah, for sure. I learned some hard lessons, unfortunately, but everybody does it. That's okay. And I think that's another part here is just like, as you're doing this the first couple of times, it is a learning process. It is not like you're not going to do it right the first time perfectly every time. And then even, after a bunch of years of doing this, like we're pretty good at it now, but mistakes happen on occasion, or people change their mind, or clients decide not to do things, or the subcontractor gets sick or whatever. Like those things happen. It's okay. So what happens if your subcontractor pushes back on the terms of your contract?
After it's signed, or when you're in negotiation?
I guess with negotiating here. So like you're negotiating, like you've sent, everybody's agreed on the estimate, and then you give them that, or it's the ICA agreement, and then the sub goes like, hey, so I'm not down with the payment terms. Whatever. What do you do then?
Yeah, I think I actually appreciate when a freelancer kind of scrutinizes our ICA a little bit. It means they're reading it. It means they've retained it.
Right.
I think you just have to decide on like what's your flexibility. Like for us, like we have larger business where like we're not going to necessarily make special use cases for individual people because it's too hard from us from a tracking standpoint to be like, oh, Brian is this and Debbie is this. Like this is what it is. If you want to work with us, this is the terms. But if you're like just starting out and you're flexible and you're like, you know what, I can do net 30, or I can do credit card payments. I'm just going to add 4% on top, or whatever it looks like for you. Then that's your call. I think when you get into a situation where maybe the freelancer is pushing back on the scope of work, I need more money, I need more time, then it's your call to say like, do I want to go ahead and look for another sub, or do I really want to work with this person? I think they're going to do a good job for this project. Then you take that adjustment back to the client. You say, hey, I can do this for this rate, but here I need to adjust the cost and I need to adjust the timeline. So it's really for you to decide on where you want to wiggle and what you want to adjust.
Yeah. And sometimes, again, being the middleman in the situation, you get squeezed If you
Mhm.
really want to work with that person and they need more money and the client, won't budge on that, then you have to make a decision about, am I willing to take less margin on my subcontractor's portion of the project in order to keep this thing rolling? Or is that margin really, really critical for me for other reasons? So yeah, that's why you build in that cushion on both sides, and you know that you're probably going to get squeezed during
Mhm.
this process. So yeah, so be aware of that. All right. Is
Yeah,
it ever okay to proceed without a contract, like when you're working with a friend, as an example?
it's never okay.
Yeah, this one's easy. No,
Yeah.
put it in writing. Like my motto is, it doesn't exist unless it's in black and white.
Unless you're
Doesn't.
okay not getting paid. It's kind of like, I'll go and I'll volunteer to mow my neighbor's lawn or like get their mail, but I'm not going to put that in the contract because they're not going to pay me, and it's fine. I would say like absolutely 100% of the time, even if it's an email or something small that you're doing, have some kind of contract. And if you feel uncomfortable doing that for like your grandma's, bunko club, then you could say, hey, I know this feels a little overkill, but this is just how I operate my business. So it helps me keep track of what I'm working on. Like you can say something that's like a
Yeah,
little caveat-y, but
yeah.
100% of the time, have something.
Absolutely. I mean, I even thought when you said go mow my neighbor's lawn, I was like, yeah, you need a contract because there's liability in you mowing the lawn.
I'm,
Like
I'm really bad at mowing too, so it might sue me.
what happens if the lawnmower kicks up a rock and, puts a rock through somebody's window?
Mhm.
Um, there's questions like that, which also, to go back to the previous discussion, that's another really important thing about your ICA and about your statement of work and stuff is liability. Cover yourself on the
Oh
liability
yeah, we didn't even
changes.
talk about insurance. That's another
We
good
did
thing to
not talk
add.
about insurance. That's another podcast.
Yeah.
And covering yourself from a liability standpoint, really, really important as well. That's probably a whole other conversation. But that's yet another reason to have a contract, is to cover yourself in case something does go wrong, or there's an act of God like a tornado, and it destroys all
Yes.
your hard drives or whatever. Like you never know. I
Fortunately.
mean, we had a flood here in Hillsborough last year, and not at my house, but I mean the River came up a whole bunch and whatever, and it could have affected people's houses that were freelancers, and they could have lost their computers or lost whatever. Like
Yeah.
that's part of the contract too. It's like, what happens then? And the answer is, you should have something in your contract that says that you're backing stuff up off site and that you guarantee that, whatever. So anyway, cover
But
yourself
I
from
will
long.
say that like having some kind of insurance is really, really key. And it's not terribly expensive. Some general professional liability insurance, like we actually cover all of our subcontractors with that. We have a buku's amount of insurance that's not required by us from our clients. So having that kind of insurance is really having workers' comp. A lot of production freelancers have to have certain types of insurance because they're on site, they're carrying equipment, it's expensive. So understand too, talk to an insurance broker, talk to a business insurance broker about what types of insurance you may need to cover. And it seems like it may be really, really expensive, but it really, especially basic, is not hard and not super complicated. And it is good to have. Yeah, I will share a story similar to yours where I knew an agency in Seattle that they had, I think it was a flood actually. They were not backing stuff offsite. It was a fire. Their agency burned down. They had a huge fire. Everything burned down. They did not have offsite backup. This is what before like cloud storage and stuff happened, and they had to shut down. So they had no backup. So thinking through, you don't want to be catastrophic and terrified, but like thinking through like what would happen if all of a sudden all of my software shut down or we had a fire or whatever. Think through those things. Think about how you can protect yourself in that situation. I'm going to have a backup to a storage that's going to pull every single day, whatever that looks like. The other side of it too is I always talk about this too, like having some kind of disability insurance. I know it is expensive, but even short-term disability, having something that if you got sick and you couldn't work, for us, it's a lot of like, I'm trading my hours for dollars. And if I'm sick and I can't work for 3 months, I'm not making any money, especially if you're a career freelancer, like that's a big deal. So thinking through those kind of things, like, again, you don't want to be catastrophic, but you want to be realistic about what happens if this happens, how am I going to still have an income? How am I going to still have a business on the other side of it? So those are some extra bonus things that we can add another call about sometime in the future, but that's also really important.
Yeah. So maybe the next one, instead of quit not covering your assets, it's quit not covering your ass.
Right.
Like,
Because it's accounting for you, not to be
yeah.
terrified, not to be like terrified people, but those are important things to think about if you want to build a business as a as a freelancer and you want to work with other people, like you need to think about those kind of like longevity planning type of things.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, this has been a fun conversation. And it's Friday and we've got the World Cup to go watch. So on to the next one, as they say. Until next time, this is John.
And I'm Maari.
And we're reminding you that quitters can win and winners can quit. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical, legal, or financial advice. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Command Q or Uncompany.